Hello, World Civilizations 2. Hopefully my recording has actually started. It's been a little bit funky today. But if you're here, you should be here for us to finally discuss World War I. And this week we will also discuss the lead up to World War II. So, should be a pretty interesting time, as this is a very popular time period among most people when it comes to American and world history. So, like I said, today we're going to focus on World War I, and we're of course going to focus on having an international perspective. Now, as always, I'm of course going to start off with some of the key terms you need to be aware of as we go throughout this lesson. We're of course going to look at the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. We're going to look at a ship called the Lusitania. We're going to look at something called the Zimmermann Telegram. We'll look at the Bolshevik Revolution. And we'll wrap things up by discussing the infamous Treaty of Versailles. Now, of course, I also do want to make sure you're aware of some important upcoming dates that you need to look at for the next few weeks. Your midterm writing assignment is also coming up in a week or two. It'll be due on October the 23rd at 5 p.m. As I mentioned before, your prompt and your rubric are already located in Moodle, so please make sure you check on that and get a head start as soon as you possibly can. At the very least, make sure you're aware of what the prompt is and what all the expectations are as soon as possible. That'll help you do the best you possibly can. The second debate is also coming up by October the 30th at 5 p.m. That, of course, is when the materials are due. The actual debate will be scheduled by email. The potential sign-up sheet is already available on Moodle. Please fill that out if you haven't already done so. But at the very least, have it filled out by October the 19th, which, if my math is correct, is next Monday. It probably isn't, so just check on your calendars when October the 19th actually is. Once that date passes, I'll look over the sign-up sheet and I'll start announcing what the official teams are going to be. Lastly, your final essay bibliography is due a good bit of time from now, but I want you to already be prepared for this, on November the 6th at 5 p.m. The details for this, like every other final essay assignment and related assignment, is located in the final essay prompt section on Moodle. To get there, all you have to do is go to the final essay section on Moodle, click on the prompt. It has the prompt, of course, for the actual final essay, and every benchmark assignment you're going to have until the final essay is due. Please make sure you look over this and you're prepared for what I expect as soon as possible. If I can help with any of this, please let me know as soon as possible, but please do check all the prompts and everything before you send me any questions. That'll make my day and your day all a little bit easier. Now, in the meantime, let's go ahead and jump into the content we have for today. Now, to start off, historians have identified four major causes for the beginning of World War I. We mentioned a few of these over the past week or so, but I want to review them here. First, imperialism. We looked at this a little bit towards the end of last week. How is imperialism going to help cause a global war? I hope you guys like these awkward pauses as much as I do. But yes, as we discussed last week, imperialism, of course, leads to increased international competition, usually. Because as you can see, when England, Germany, and France and other various countries were setting up their empires, they weren't exactly very cooperative most of the time in helping other countries set up their empires. Instead of saying, hey, Germany, I'm really proud of that empire you've set up, England and France, for example, would often try to compete with them to limit their imperial power and increase their own. This, of course, as you might imagine, can set up the likelihood for war, because many countries were willing to fight to defend their empires and limit their enemies. Mutual defense alliance, because of this, mutual defense alliances also sprang up amongst various European countries. What exactly are these, do you think? As I stroke my beard again like a James Bond villain. But yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. It's essentially just in the name. It's the idea that you make an alliance with the country, and if that country is attacked, you'll defend them. If you're attacked, they will defend you. Now, why would that help cause a global war as well? Again, fairly straightforward question. You can see that in the graph or the picture right here, we'll call it. Not very good with words today, apparently. But see, let's imagine that every country disappeared on this chart except for just Russia and Serbia. If they have a conflict with each other, they'll go to war. No big deal for the rest of the world. It's between Russia and Serbia. However, add the rest of these countries in here, and you're going to have a much bigger conflict. Russia is allied with Serbia. They might join this conflict. Or France is allied with Russia. Sorry, they might join this conflict. Austria-Hungary is allied with Serbia. They might join as well. Or allied with Bulgaria. They might join as well. Germany's allied with Austria-Hungary. They join. Britain's allied with Russia. They join in. It's essentially just a game of calling up your friends to help you with the schoolyard brawl. It starts off as just a conflict between two different countries, but then because of this imperial conflict and these different alliances, other countries start getting pulled in. You get a global war. As we mentioned also a little bit, I believe last week, militarism was also on the rise during this time period. It makes sense. You have all these imperial conflicts, you have all these alliances being formed. Many European countries wanted to build up strong militaries in order to protect their empires and to effectively compete with each other. This meant when war did break out, you already had these large militaries ready to go. Finally, nationalism, because of this imperial conflict, was also on the rise as well. Nationalism is considered, or nationalism, of course, has something to do with pride in your country. However, let's focus on something for a second. Is it different than patriotism? And is nationalism and patriotism good things? Think about that for a second. As I sit here awkwardly waiting for answers for people who aren't going to view this video for a few days. I like to think it's me traveling through time almost. Yeah, some of you might be aware of this. This is something that comes up a lot in terms of American pride, for example, these days. Patriotism is just considered to be a great pride and a love in one's country. You're willing to fight for your country. You're willing to participate in your country's politics, economics, anything to help benefit your country. Nationalism, by many political scientists, is essentially considered to be a more extreme and negative version of patriotism. Nationalism is not just pride in your country, it's considered to be pride in your country at the expense of other countries. So, for example, if you were an American nationalist, not only would you try to promote American ideals and American desires, you'd be willing to do it at the expense, or to the detriment even, of other countries' desires. So, many people consider patriotism to be a good thing, and at least in most cases I would tend to agree. It's not a bad thing, of course, necessarily to have pride in your country and to want to better your country. However, many political scientists consider nationalism to be one of the big causes of World War I, because it ensured that in order to help win these imperial conflicts and contests that Europeans were starting to have, they were essentially willing to go to any length they needed to ensure they could be successful. This is credited as being a major reason why World War I was as violent as it was. Anyhow, moving on, as many of you are probably aware, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand is considered to be the essential cause of World War I. To give you a little bit of knowledge about this event, Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke, essentially the vice president of the Austria-Hungary Empire prior to World War I. On June 28, 1914, he and his wife Sophie, also known as the Duchess of Hohenberg, were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand. The Black Hand were motivated by a desire to try to control Austrian territories that they possessed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So again, it's essentially an example of that imperialism and those nationalist tendencies. Portions of Serbia wanted to control portions of the Austria-Hungary Empire, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths in order to accomplish it. Or in this case, at least the Black Hand was. Now, based on what we've already discussed, why is this seemingly isolated incident going to lead to a global war? I never know where to look during these pauses. Do I stare at the camera? That's probably creepy. But yes, as you might guess, this goes back to the mutual alliances. So first you just have Serbia upset with Austria-Hungary, but then Austria-Hungary's empires are all going to come in, allies are going to come in, Serbia's allies are going to come to its support, you get a global conflict. To help illustrate that, here are some of the immediate responses in the months following this assassination, or the weeks even. By July 28th, Austria-Hungary had officially declared war on Serbia. By August the 1st, Germany had declared war on Russia. Why would they do that, you may ask? Well, yeah, let's go back to this chart. Remember, Germany is an ally of Austria-Hungary, while I'm going to move my train of thought. While Russia is, of course, an ally of Serbia. So essentially, Germany's trying to jump the gun and go ahead and attack one of the allies that's attacking their ally. Again, sort of a bit of a complicated web, but it shows how these mutual defense alliances are dragging different countries into the war. By August the 3rd, Germany had officially declared war on France and, as you may know, invaded through Belgium in order to get to France. By August the 4th, Great Britain had then declared war on Germany. So as you can see in this cartoon right here, it's essentially just a chain reaction. Serbia irritates Austria-Hungary, they're attacked. Russia comes in to defend their ally. Germany comes in to defend their ally. France is coming in to defend their ally. So on and so forth. Just a big chain of allies coming in and attacking each other. However, the U.S., as you might have seen, did remain neutral throughout most of World War I. Now, why do you think the U.S. actually remained neutral in World War I? Yeah, I gave this one away a little bit. Of course, the U.S. internationally portrayed itself as wanting to promote peace and goodwill and not get involved in European squabbles. However, it is important to note that the United States did actively sell ammunition and weapons to both sides of the war in the initial stages of World War I. This was actually a huge boom to the economy of the United States. It's actually considered to be one of the reasons that the United States became a great industrial power, is because of all the money they made selling to these warring countries while they were able to stay neutral and not have their industry just get demolished. However, think about what might be some of the consequences to this. For example, let's imagine that you're in just your own personal turf war, I guess, for example. For those of you who maybe play Grand Theft Auto, for example. Not that I would recommend that game. I'm actually not a fan. But yeah, just imagine you're fighting someone and you know that you have somebody who's selling weapons to both different sides of this turf war, whatever it might be. On the one hand, you might like receiving those weapons, of course, but on the other, you might want to cut off your enemy's access to those same weapons. A lot of times, people aren't going to be very happy with someone who's selling weapons to their enemy, even though they're not directly involved in the war. This was often the case. This is the case with many of the countries involved in World War I. Now, we'll get to the impact of that a little bit later, but first I want to introduce sort of the main structure on how World War I was fought. As many of you may be aware, World War I was essentially a war that was fought on two fronts. Germany and their allies were in the middle, while they were fighting the Russian Empire on one side, and France and the United Kingdom on the other. Now, let's start with the obvious. Why is this would this be considered to be a disadvantage? Yeah, this map probably makes it pretty obvious as well. The Russian Empire only has to worry about fighting Germany on their western border. France and the United Kingdom only have to worry about repelling Germany on their eastern border. Germany, on the other hand, and Austria-Hungary can be initially invaded by both sides simultaneously. This means that instead of being able to concentrate their military in just a couple of key locations, they have to be stretched as thinly as possible in order to repel a variety of different invasions. This, of course, made it very difficult. However, there were opportunities where this was seen to be an advantage, because the idea was that Germany could essentially attack on either of these, throw their main attack on either of these fronts, and no one necessarily knew where their attack was going to come from. For example, Germany's famous initial war plan was to try to quickly go in and invade and conquer Belgium and France, while they would then go and attack the Russian Empire. Whereas, of course, it was obvious where the Russian Empire and the French and the United Kingdom was going to go. However, of course, this did primarily end up being a disadvantage for Germany, as you could probably guess. The Western Front, as you can see here, was primarily located in central France, and it was primarily a conflict between Germany, France, Belgium, and Great Britain. The Eastern Front primarily consisted of the Russian invasion of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the east. Now, next thing I want to discuss is to get a little bit more in detail about the effects of trench warfare. What I'd like you guys to do, I can't play it here for probable copyright reasons, but I want you to watch one of the trailers from the recent movie 1917. Fantastic movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it. As you watch, look out for some of the shots that show the reality of trench warfare, what it was like, and be prepared to discuss it. That's going to come up a little bit this week. Also, as you watch it, keep in mind that one aspect of the trailer has been identified by historians as not being historically accurate. Can any of you guess what it is? And if you figure it out, please do let me know. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and look at some of those more specific trench warfare characteristics. Trench warfare was a huge and extensive method of warfare, and it covered huge portions of the conflict area. For example, along the Western and Eastern Front previously mentioned in World War I, there were roughly 35,000 miles total of trenches from both sides. There are a few key problems with trench warfare I want to focus on really briefly. A couple of them you would have seen in that 1917 trailer if you've already paused and watched it, which if you haven't, please go ahead and do that already before we get into this. But anyway, a few of the major problems. One of the major problems military historians have identified with World War I is the mix of machine guns and old military tactics. For the first time in World War I, handheld automatic weapons were now relatively readily available. However, most military generals and military advisors hadn't really caught up to this yet and still used old school, as we'll call them, warfare tactics. For those of you who are familiar with how this worked, you look at things like the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Since you only had these guns that couldn't fire as quickly as a machine gun, people would just line straight up in front of each other, fire each other for a little bit until one side retreated. Now, that was possible, like I said, because these old muskets armies used to use had a very slow rate of fire. For example, can anyone actually guess how many rounds per minute a Revolutionary War musket could fire? Hopefully you're guessing at home. But yeah, some of you might have gotten it, but at best, the average is estimated to have been about around 1 round per minute could be fired by a musket. So therefore, it's relatively effective to just line up in front of each other and shoot when you can only fire once per minute, and your guns aren't really that accurate anyway. However, once you get these machine guns that can fire dozens and eventually hundreds of rounds per minute, people are of course going to get just mowed down if you just march ahead in a straight line. This is one of the main reasons historians believe that the casualties were so high in World War I. The heavy artillery in no man's land was a major problem as well. Artillery shells were also being heavily used in World War I, which would destroy and devastate the no man's land in between the trenches. They'd be filled with barbed wire, huge craters, and all sorts of problems that made this no man's land very difficult to cross. This, combined again with the new machine guns, meant that these trenches didn't move very much throughout the war. For example, there were some battles in World War I where thousands of casualties would occur in just a couple of days of combat, all for less than a mile of territory gained in this trench warfare. So essentially, people could be stuck in these trenches for months on end. Finally, chemical warfare was also widely used during this conflict, particularly mustard gas. In the close confined quarters of a trench, if a chemical weapon was able to get in there, it of course could have devastating effects. For example, with mustard gas, even if a soldier was to survive the mustard gas, they would often be blinded for the rest of their life. So again, these are just a few of the characteristics that made trench warfare just such a horrible experience. Now, we of course need to get into how America eventually joined the war. Historians have come up with 5 major reasons why America entered the war. We'll focus on a few of them particularly. 1. In May 1915, the British ship Lusitania was sunk by the Germans due to military supplies being on board. That, of course, is supposed to say Germans. I'll fix that before I post this PowerPoint. However, on this boat, 128 Americans were killed, so some saw this as a breach of neutrality. However, many historians identify the main reason for us joining the war is the 1917 Zimmermann telegram. In this telegram, a German ambassador offered Mexico lost territory if they declared war on America. Now, looking at American and Mexican history for a bit, why might this idea particularly appeal to Mexico? Trying to keep my voice. Can be a bit tough. But yes, for those of you who are a bit familiar with American and Mexican history, not too long before this, less than 100 years ago, America had won the Mexican-American War and claimed a huge portion of Mexican territory. Germany was essentially offering to get that territory back. However, unrestricted submarine warfare is also considered to be a major cause. Again, due to trying to prevent America from supplying their enemies, Germany did declare unregulated or unrestricted submarine warfare in their water spaces. Essentially, this meant that the Germans would sink any ship that was carrying any sort of military personnel or military weapons, no matter who they were allied to or what nation they were a part of. This, of course, directly led to the British sinking of the ship Lusitania, even though it officially was not a military boat and had Americans on board. Another one I also thought that was particularly interesting is the economic interests. Many American businessmen, such as J.P. Morgan, who some of you might know is a great banker in the Gilded Age, were particularly pressured the government to get involved in the war because of the roughly $3 billion they had loaned to the Allied powers. Why do you think this would motivate them to get involved in the war? Yes, very good. As you might guess, these people were scared that if Germany won the war and defeated these Allied powers, they'd never get their money back. So there was a little economic interest in America getting involved. Finally, another example of yellow journalism, which you might have heard about before. German atrocities were publicized occurring in Belgium, although many of these were actually British propaganda. Now, one other thing I want to talk about before we conclude the war is the Russian exit from World War I. Between October and November of 1917, Russia underwent the Bolshevik Revolution. This was a revolution in Russia led by Vladimir Lenin. Now, what philosophy exactly do you think this revolution believed in? What kind of government, politics, and economy did they want? Alright, again, very good class. This is the first example of a successful communist revolution. So once this revolution was over for the first time, we have an official European communist country. Between 1917 and 1922, Russia was engaged in a civil war, and by 1922, Lenin and his communists and Bolsheviks were successful and were able to establish the infamous Soviet Union. Why is this so historically significant? Alright, yeah, those of you who are familiar with the Cold War could probably figure this one out. This is considered by many to be sort of the start of the Cold War in a way, because this is when the great Super Soviet Union's communist superpower was formed, which of course would lead to the communist and capitalist clash that would dominate most of the world for the next several decades. So essentially, this is where your American fears and Western fears against communism got their start. However, I do want to wrap things up a little bit, of course, and talk about the conclusion of World War I. America's entry into the war, of course, was considered to be very significant, because as you notice, the war initially started all the way back in 1914. America didn't join until about 3 years into the war. Why would that be such a significant thing for the Allied powers? Alright, yes, very good. Again, imaginary class is hopefully watching this at home. This, of course, was essentially just an extra boost to the Allied powers. Both sides were very weary and depleted from fighting this war. America was essentially a fresh entry who gave them the morale and material boost they needed to win. For example, between August and September of 1918, an Allied offensive managed to push the Germans through the Mace River and Argonne Forest and eventually reach the German border. For example, for those of you who've heard the famous "Do you want to live forever" quote, that quote is credited from coming from First Sergeant Dan Daly during this conflict in the fall of 1918. Also, the end of the war was hastened by the 1918 Spanish influenza, which had an estimated death toll of 40 to 100 million. So essentially, it's the coronavirus on steroids, which obviously, when you already have a world war going on, a massive outbreak like this is going to be even more devastating. Therefore, by November 11th in 1918, Germany officially signed an armistice and agreed to surrender their weapons, surrender most of their navy, and evacuate all territory they had occupied throughout the war. This, of course, led to the infamous Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a document signed on June 28, 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, which officially ended World War I. There are a few major provisions you need to be aware of. First, Germany was required to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage. Quote, and I quote, also, they lost around 25,000 square miles of territory and about 7 million of their citizens. Some of this territory was given to the defeated Allied powers, and as we'll talk a little bit more about next week, or in just a little bit, some of this territory was given to form new nations. Germany also lost all of their former colonies. Next, the German Army and Navy were heavily restricted. The Army was limited to only 100,000 soldiers. The Navy was limited to 36 boats, none of which were allowed to go over 200 tons. And, as you might imagine, due to the unrestricted submarine warfare, they were no longer allowed to produce submarines. Finally, Germany was fined about 132 billion marks in reparations, which, to give a bit of context, would equal about 442 billion US dollars in 2020. Now, to think about, this is something I want you to think about, because it, of course, is going to come up in assignments and throughout the rest of the week. What exactly are the Allied goals of this treaty? And to give you a hint, it's not just about ending the war. What else are they trying to do to Germany? Next, how do you think these provisions are going to affect Germany? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how is this treaty going to give the Nazis an opportunity? So again, think about all those things when you're looking at the Treaty of Versailles. Again, that's all I have for you today. Please look over these final reminders. If you have any questions about upcoming assignments or course content, please let me know as soon as possible. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again digitally at whatever point this week you watch the next video. Thank you.